if you want to start by introducing yourself and this beautiful, oh, it's glowing. It's glowing.
I know the team did such a good job. I'm absolutely obsessed with this foil. Um, but yes, I'm Akshaya Raman. I am the author of the Ivory Key. Sure, yeah. So this is a YA fantasy which follows four estranged royal siblings on a quest to try to find magic. Magic is a resource that's running out. So there's a little bit of a treasure hunt element, a little bit of a family drama element, a little bit of angst and romance, lots of food. So if any of that is your cup of tea, then I think you'll like this book.
Definitely. It's a great book. I think the first question was a little bit mean of them, and that's if you could sum the Ivory Key up in just one word, which I think is really super hard. What would that word be?
You know, I have gotten questions where people have asked me 3 or 4 words, and I think that's pretty hard. One is quite hard, and I think I would say family, because I think the heart of this book is family. And at the end of the day, no matter what other things are in the book, what other things like changed, the heart of this book was always that family dynamic. So I think that's probably the one word that I would use.
I know, I thought it was super mean. I was like, 3 or 4 would be tough, but like 1 seems impossible. But I think family's a really good one to go for. And it does draw me to one of their extra questions that they slipped into my emails last minute. And I think it's quite a good one. What drew you to write about kind of a family versus the found family aspect that you usually kind of find in fantasy? A lot of obviously YA fantasy in particular, when there's like a quest or a journey, it tends to be more with that kind of like found family element. But obviously we have 4 siblings in this book, and I adored the fact it was an actual family, because I don't think I have read as many fantasies with that element in. But they wanted to know what drew you to a family versus a found family, I guess.
Yeah, it's a couple of different things, and I think there are like found family elements too, like Ria's family. Like she thinks a lot about like the people I'm related to versus, you know, the people I have chosen to be my family. But I was very interested, I think, in the idea of different people are shaped by these shared experiences, because we're all sort of all shaped by the people who raised us and whatever that family looks like. And so I was very interested in the idea of these 4 siblings who shared their upbringings. So they were raised by the same people with the same sort of pressures that were put on them, but they all internalized them a little bit differently. So that was very fascinating to me to look at. And that was part of the reason I decided to have them be like actual siblings. Another like big influence for me while working on this was the originals, like the TV show. And I was very fascinated by the idea that you have these like siblings who are vampires. They've obviously been together for many, many hundreds of years, and they say things like always and forever, and they are trying to protect each other. But then they do these kind of horrible things to each other in the name of protection, like, oh, I'm doing this horrible thing to you because I love you so much. And like, there's some amount of like toxicity to that. The siblings in this book don't quite get that toxic, but there were definitely like elements of that that were in there that I thought were very fascinating.
Yeah, it's part of what I enjoyed most about the book, like just seeing how, like, even down to 2 characters seeing things from different viewpoints and kind of highlighting like you can both go through the same thing and see it on a completely different way, and how that then causes them to react to each other. So I really kind of adored that element of the book. The next one was, what was the inspiration for writing the Ivory Key?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the originals. That was a really big source of inspiration. Other things that inspired me were a lot of like favorite movies. that I loved when I was younger, like National Treasure, Indiana Jones, a little bit of The Mummy, you know, and even like other movies that are not like those typical quest movies, like Pirates of the Caribbean was a really big influence on me when I was younger. So things like that definitely shaped some of this book. The other really big source of inspiration that I had is not really something that exists in the book anymore, but it was Robin Hood. My very, very original idea was I wanted to write a Robin Hood retelling. And you can still kind of see the remnants of this in like Rhea's storyline, but it always was interesting to me to think about a character who was stealing from the crown, but what if the person that they were stealing from was actually somebody they were related to? And I was like, oh, that adds like a level of complexity to it. And so I knew that I wanted to write something about families. I knew I wanted there to be a questy element. And then this like Robin Hood idea kind of bridged the two together. And then eventually all those things kind of came together. And I was like, oh, okay, this is the story that I'd like to tell. And the Robin Hood thing kind of is no longer really a part of the story, but it was a very big like initial inspiration.
And you can definitely see the kind of threads through it. Now that you've mentioned it, it's so like clear, like to see where the influences from that came in, and that's awesome. Um, Another one they wanted to ask is why you chose to kind of write a fantasy book.
Yeah, so there were a couple of different things, a couple of different reasons for that. One is that I wanted to set it in like a version of India. This is not historical. It's not set in a particular time period or anything like that. I gave myself the freedom to sort of pull from various different time periods, but also I wanted to be able to bring in some of the things that I grew up with and like some modern sensibilities and things like that to the world. And so setting it in a fantasy world kind of gave me the opportunity to pull from other influences. Like I grew up in California, and so a lot of the media that I grew up with was, you know, American media. And so those are the things that really shaped me and influenced me. And so being able to incorporate those influences as well into the story kind of gave me that flexibility, having it be a fantasy world rather than setting it in like a contemporary or historical. And also, I just really like being able to do things like magic and, you know, have some really fun like consequences that come from things like having magical powers, or in this case like a resource that's magical. So I always think that's fun as a reader as well. I'm really drawn to fantasy worlds, and they can feel so immersive and feel very much like, okay, this is a new place that I get to inhabit for some amount of time.
Yeah, I definitely think fantasy, it's just that really transportative kind of book to read. Like you just get drawn in and you kind of leave all disbelief at the door, and you just end up in this like magical realm where, like, I think as a kid I always loved fantasy, because especially when I started finding them with female leads, because I was like, I could be a badass. Like I couldn't, in no world would I be like amazing with a bow and arrow, or be able to like wield magic and be really like awesome. But it gives you that sense of like
Yeah.
anything can happen and you can be anything kind of thing,
Yes.
that I think I love about fantasy. But you mentioned your magic that's within the book. The magic in the book's awesome and really unique. Obviously, it's almost
Oh.
kind of, I found it almost had like a scientific element to it, and that it's very much like a resource that, like, I suppose it's comparable to like gas or electricity in a way.
Mhm.
What made you
Sure,
kind of
yeah.
come up with the idea to have it as this like all-encompassing element that would act as not just lighting but work as like a border barrier to protect the kingdom as well?
Yeah, so the inspiration for the magic came from a few different sources. Like you sort of mentioned, like the resource element and like depleting resources. I think that's something that we can all sort of relate to as like a global concern that we have. So there was definitely some element of that to that I really wanted to incorporate. The other thing was growing up, I hardly ever saw any fantasy books where magic wasn't like, oh, you inherit this power from like this long lineage, your family is magical, therefore you get to be. And those families with magical blood hardly ever looked like mine. And so I really wanted to have a magic that anybody could learn to use, because that's something that as a kid I really wanted. I was like, what if I'm not from that family, but I still want to be magical and cool? And so that was a little bit of what inspired that as well. But I knew that I wanted it to be like a quest of some kind. And so I knew in order for it to feel like because it can't just be, well, I go and steal magic that is like a power, like that can also be interesting, but I felt like it was a little bit harder to explain. And so making it a physical resource would then mean I could have it be more easily accessible in the sort of um, treasure hunt context as well.
Definitely. I love that it's just like around in the world and it's there and everybody's like got access to it. And the stakes are really high with it running out. Like it
Right.
literally makes the stakes so high that like it's incredible. Um Obviously in your world, certain objects can be and have been imbued with magic, which leads us to the question, if you could have any magical object, what would it be and why?
Okay, so I did think about this a little bit, and my answer is just it's just like proof that I am an old person, I'm an adult, because I was like, you know what would be really great if like I could have self-organizing things. Like if you just like threw a bunch of books into a bookshelf and the bookshelf just organized it for you, how amazing would that be? Or like, you throw your like clothes into like a drawer and it just folds it nicely for you. Like how amazing would that be? That's
Yeah,
what I want. I'm just like, how can I make my chores easier, do the things that I don't want to do? Like I hate folding laundry. I can wash my clothes, but I do not enjoy like folding them and putting them away. If I could just like throw it all into a closet and just did it for me, like, oh, that would be amazing. That's the dream.
especially socks. There is nothing I hate more than matching up socks, like after you
Yes.
wash them and everything. It's so
Yes.
tedious, like nobody wants to do it, but if you don't,
Yeah.
you're only making it worse for yourself later when you're trying to like find the socks. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm with you on that one. That is that would be the best. That would cut my day in like half. There would be so
Right.
much more time to do reading and fun things
Yes.
and yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. If I could just like cut down a lot of my like cleaning and organizing time, like if I could just dump things like onto my counter and it would just like sort all of my like skincare products into their like places, or well, whatever it is. Like I just want a lot of things that just like self-organize for me. And then I could just find them exactly in the same place every time and I have to put no effort into it. That's the dream. Those are the kinds of magical objects that I want.
Now you've mentioned it, I'm really sad that that is not a thing because it would make my life would make my life so much easier because I'm one of those people that I like everything to have a place, but also I don't like the fact that that
Yeah.
means I have to put them in that place every time. Like, so yeah,
Yeah.
I'm with you on that one.
Yeah, or like things where you can just find things easily, like car keys or like glasses and things like that. I feel like that would also be convenient. Or like that one thing that I knew that I needed, so I put it in a very safe
Safe
place, and then
place.
now I cannot remember the very safe place I put it. So things like that. Yeah, it's just
Key.
things that just make our, yeah,
Yeah, that would
yes.
be I am so with you on that. I think that would be a great like magical objects to have. Um Obviously your book is written across multiple perspectives. Was it tricky for you to kind of keep a voice for each of them? Because when you're reading each of them, it's really clear who it is, if that makes sense. And I imagine that's quite tricky. Um going from one to another, or it quite easy, or?
Yeah, so I kind of did it in two different passes. So when I'm working on the story, I typically tend to work chronologically just so I can make sure, okay, like this information is revealed and then this and then this, and it sort of makes sense. And so most of the revisions that I do are actually chronological, but I will do one pass at some point where I work by point of view, where I will only like, read all of Ria's chapters and do any edits there. And this helps me a lot when it comes to character arcs, but also a little bit of voice, because once I'm sort of immersed in that perspective, I know, okay, this is what this character cares about. This is what they're going to notice in a scene. And that sort of helps me keep them a little bit distinct from one another. But it was difficult. It was difficult for me to figure out what each of them cared about, and some of them were easier to write than others. And so it was a little bit of trial and error on my part.
Who was the most difficult to write for in that case?
Oh my gosh, Ronak, hands down. He is my problem child.
It's
He
definitely
had
complicated.
a completely different, yeah, I mean, he had a completely different story for like several drafts. Like some of my early drafts, he was just doing completely different things. He had different people he was hanging out with. He had different priorities. He had different problems. He kind of had a different personality, not entirely, but a little bit. So it was a lot of figuring out how he fit into everybody else's story. There were multiple points of time when I actually thought about cutting his perspective altogether because I was like, this is not working.
No.
And I know it's like weird now to ever like to think that I ever considered that, because he is such an integral part of the story, but like he was giving me a lot of problems. And so I just could not figure out the best way to make it all work. The second hardest one to write was Ria. Weirdly enough, the thing that changed like multiple times was not really what she was doing in the book. That was fine. The thing that I was heavily revising was her backstory, like what happened since she left the palace. And in several of the early drafts, she had left years ago. She had left when she was a kid. And then in like later drafts, I realized, oh, she can't have been gone for like 7 years. That doesn't really make a lot of sense and story wise. So it was a lot of like going back and forth on when she had left, how she had left, why she had left. That all changed. And it was the weirdest revision I've ever done because it doesn't really change what's happening in the chapters, but it was kind of influencing every single scene that she was in, because what her past was shaping how she was acting in the present, if that makes sense.
Yeah, every one of her decisions, you can kind of see where it's coming from based off obviously what she's experienced and her
Right.
kind of backstory. So that totally makes sense. Um, so who was your favorite character to write in that case?
It's really hard for me to pick a point of view who was favorite, because I really loved writing both Vera and Caleb's chapters, but they were still points of view. They still gave me trouble. But like I would say some of like the minor characters were always the more fun to write, the ones that don't have a point of view. Surya, who is like the mercenary character, he was a lot of fun to write. Kavita, who's one of the ravens, like Ria's friend, she was also really fun to write. So I really liked writing those characters because they come on the page, they say a lot of like really funny quips, and then they leave. And I'm like, this is fun.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously throughout the whole book you've got this kind of like treasure hunt quest vibe. How hard was it to kind of like lay the seeds and keep track of each of the pieces as you was going through the book? Did you have kind of the treasure map almost written out beforehand, or did that progress as you kind of went through?
That's a really good question. And I want to say that I think eventually I did kind of make like a spreadsheet to sort of track certain things where I would have like, all the different chapters in like across the rows, and then the columns would be like different subplots. So I could sort of track like, oh, this is where they learned this piece of information. But that was like pretty later on, like I would say closer to the end of my revision process was when I was sort of doing that to make sure nothing got lost and everything was clearly explained. But like early on, I was just kind of figuring it out as I went along. So I would write something and then see how it worked, or like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, like that's really cool, I really like that, so let me think about how I can expand that. So it definitely took a lot of tries and a lot of like iterations, and also getting feedback from like, my critique partners, my agent, my editor, to say, okay, that is working, that's not working. And so then I could sort of work from there and see how I could um, like revise it so that it made sense, and like the reveals were happening at the right time, and the clues that they were learning were building. But a lot of it was me just kind of figuring it out as I went, and then finessing it using like a spreadsheet later to make sure everything was neatly tied up.
I love that. Like that would be how I work. Like as I go, and then I'll make sure it kind of comes together at the end. But like I think if I ever attempted anything like that, if I did it beforehand, I'd want to make too many changes, and it would almost
Yes.
be pointless me trying to plan it out to start with.
Yeah.
Um so um obviously this is a YA title. Was there anything in particular that kind of drew you to writing for YA, or did the story just lend that you wanted to write just lend itself to YA?
It's really a combination of both. I really love reading YA, and it was something that I've loved since I was a teenager. Like I grew up like right around the time that like YA was really exploding. Like I read Twilight when I was a teenager, so that was really my introduction to it. So it was always something that I have loved reading. And when I decided to write this story, I kind of wanted to write something that was like for my teenage self. And that was a big part of why I wanted this to be YA. But also, like, as I sort of started to explore the story a little bit, I knew that it was going to be YA because, there were these, I wanted them to be a little bit younger. I wanted them to be teenagers, sort of figuring out who they are in this world, figuring out how they relate to, their families, and the ways in which they either choose to uphold or reject the things that they have been raised with. So I felt like those were kind of very teenage struggles. And so it made the most sense for it to stay YA rather than aging it up to adult or something.
Definitely. I think YA is just, I mean, I'm 27 now and I still adore YA, and I think it is that kind of the time that and the ages that you're writing about lend themselves so well to all these kind of like life questions,
Yeah.
and they're so relatable because we've even you read even as an adult you've grown up and you remember what it's like. So I think I I mostly read YA, I'm not gonna lie, I adore it. um we're nearly at the end now. If you love the Ivory Key, you will also love.
Ooh, that is always such a hard question for me to answer. Obviously, some of the books that I used as like influences for me were things like The Gilded Wolves by Roshni Chokshi, absolutely love the book. We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faizal, another book that I really adored. So much like beautiful description in there. Also involves like a magical treasure hunt. There Will Come a Darkness by Katie Rose Poole, big, epic world, multiple points of view. Same with the Witchlands books like Truth Witch by Susan Dennard. That was a really big influence on my own world building. And she is truly just a master of world building. Like that's such a beautiful, complex, like layered world. And I love spending time in that series. Yeah, I would say those are probably my like top books that if you liked my book, then you would like theirs, or if you liked their books, you would probably like my book as well.
Yeah, they are very good choices actually. And the last question, which was probably the most asked, is how long do we have to wait for the next one?
I don't quite know yet.
I'm a stressful question.
I am still working on the book. I'm actually currently working on it. I can tell you a little bit about it, which is that there's going to be like a little bit more action. There's like more sibling family drama. There's Definitely more food. I was very surprised at how much like people resonated with the food in the book. So I'm like, yeah, I have to keep that up. So it's gonna be more food, a little bit more romance. Um, it's been a lot of fun to work on. So I will hopefully have more information to share about that in the coming months about like a specific release date and things like that.
And we'll all be queuing up at the bookshop to get it because it's an incredible book. Like, I
Yeah.
loved it, like from the fact that it was like a family and the treasure hunt was incredible and the ending, oh my. So before we go, do you want to quickly tell us where we can find you on the interweb, maybe Instagram and that kind of thing, so they can keep an eye out for any announcements following this
Yeah.
duty?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is akshayaraman.com, and I have a newsletter there. It's like a quarterly newsletter, so it's not like a very frequent updates or anything like that, but that's probably the best way to make sure that you get like direct updates on things. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Aksh, AKSH, Raman, RAMAN, and that's pretty much it in terms of social media. I'm just on Twitter and Instagram, mostly on Instagram these days, and I'm barely on Twitter.
Yeah, I definitely prefer Instagram. I do like Twitter, but there's just something about Instagram, I think, that like
Yeah.
is incredible, and it doesn't cut my words out. Like, there's nothing more stressful than trying
Yes.
to like write a caption and then realizing you've only got like 3 words left.
Yes.
I'm not
Very
that
true.
kind of person. I rabble too much, as you can see when I speak, and I'm the same when I write. So it's like there's no way I can fit it into 100 and whatever characters or whatever it
Same.
is on Twitter. So definitely with you on that one. Well, thank you so much for talking to me and answering
Sure.
all the book club questions. It's
Thank
been
you for having me. These were such
amazing.
great questions.
I wish
Thank
I
you
could take
so much.
credit for them all, but sadly I can't. But it's been amazing to talk to you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.